I discovered my mother-in-law has been feeding my son food I specifically said he's allergic to because she thinks I'm making it up for attention. The paramedic's gloved hand was still pressing the EpiPen into my son's thigh when my mother-in-law said, "See, he's fine. I told you he wasn't really allergic." I watched the ambulance lights paint red and blue shadows across our driveway while my 4-year-old son gasped for air on a stretcher, his face still swollen beyond recognition, and the woman who'd nearly killed him stood there with her arms crossed like she'd just won an argument. My wife was screaming something at her mother, but the words didn't register. All I could hear was the oxygen mask hissing over my son's face and the static crackle of the paramedic's radio calling ahead to Children's Hospital. Later, when the detective asked me when I first suspected something was wrong, I realized the answer was everywhere. I just hadn't wanted to see it. Oliver had been diagnosed with severe food allergies when he was 18 months old. Not the kind where you get a little itchy or uncomfortable. The kind where his airway closes and his blood pressure drops, and you have 3 to 5 minutes before brain damage starts. Tree nuts, specifically almonds and cashews, would kill him. Dr. Rebecca Thornton, his pediatric allergist with 11 years specializing in anaphylaxis cases, had been crystal clear during that first appointment. She'd shown us photos of other children mid-reaction, walked us through emergency protocols, prescribed 2 EpiPens that I carried everywhere. My wife Jennifer and I had taken it seriously from day one. We'd cleared our house of anything containing nuts, learned to read ingredient labels like bomb technicians diffusing explosives, called ahead to every restaurant and birthday party. For 2.5 years, we'd kept Oliver safe. Then Jennifer's mother moved to town. Diane arrived in our lives 6 months before the incident, relocating from Phoenix after her divorce was finalized. She'd always been overbearing, the kind of mother-in-law who had opinions about everything from how we decorated to how often we called, but Jennifer loved her despite the friction. When Diane announced she was buying a condo 20 minutes away, my gut told me this would complicate things. Jennifer saw it as a chance to rebuild their relationship. I saw it as someone who'd spent 32 years telling Jennifer she was doing everything wrong, now with proximity and grandparent access. But I kept my mouth shut. Marriage is compromise, and if Jennifer wanted her mother nearby, I'd make it work. I just didn't know the cost of that compromise would nearly be measured in my son's life. The problems started small. Little comments during Sunday dinners about how kids these days have so many allergies, and we never worried about this stuff when Jennifer was little. Diane would watch me check ingredient labels and shake her head like I was performing some paranoid ritual. When I explained about cross-contamination and how even trace amounts could trigger a reaction, she'd nod with this tight smile that made it clear she thought I was overreacting. Jennifer would jump to my defense, but Diane had this way of backing down just enough to seem reasonable while making you feel like the crazy one. I started to dread her visits, not because I didn't want Oliver to know his grandmother, but because every interaction felt like a subtle interrogation of our parenting choices. Still, she never directly challenged the allergy restrictions, not in front of us anyway. The first real warning sign came 3 months in. Jennifer and I had taken Oliver to Diane's condo for lunch. I'd sent her a detailed list of safe foods days in advance, and when we arrived, everything seemed fine. She'd made chicken fingers and apple slices, all from packages I'd approved. But while Jennifer was in the bathroom and I was helping Oliver wash his hands, I noticed something in Diane's pantry. Through the half-open door, I could see a jar of almond butter on the middle shelf. Not hidden, not tucked away, just sitting there next to the peanut butter and jelly. My stomach dropped. I called Jennifer over, pointed it out quietly. She confronted her mother immediately, voice tight with worry. Diane acted confused, said she'd forgotten, promised to throw it out. Jennifer watched her drop it in the trash, and we left shortly after. On the drive home, Jennifer was quiet. "She forgot," she finally said. "It's a big adjustment." I wanted to believe that. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone who'd been told a dozen times that certain foods could kill her grandson wouldn't just forget. I started watching more carefully during visits. Diane had this habit of trying to feed Oliver directly, bypassing us entirely. She'd offer him snacks from her purse or suggest treats she'd brought, always with this casual energy like she was just being a loving grandmother. Every time, Jennifer or I would intercept, check ingredients, often find something problematic. Tree nut warnings on granola bars, cookies made in facilities that processed almonds. Once, she pulled out a bag of trail mix with cashews visible through the plastic. When Jennifer pointed it out, Diane acted shocked, like she simply hadn't noticed. But I'd seen her reading glasses. She could read fine print. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, but I still didn't have proof of intent. Just this growing dread that my son wasn't safe around his own grandmother. The breaking point came on a Saturday in late September. Jennifer had a work emergency, one of those all-hands crisis calls that couldn't wait. Her firm was in the middle of a massive audit, and her boss needed her on site immediately. We'd planned a quiet day at home with Oliver, but suddenly I was scrambling to figure out childcare. My parents lived 3 states away. Our usual sitter was out of town. Jennifer suggested her mother, and before I could formulate a good reason to say no, she was already calling Diane. I felt my chest tighten. I pulled Jennifer aside, told her I wasn't comfortable with it. She looked at me like I'd suggested something crazy. "She's his grandmother," Jennifer said, "and she knows the rules." I wanted to argue, to explain the almond butter incident and the trail mix and every small thing that had been building for months, but Jennifer's phone was ringing again with her boss's name on the screen. We were out of time and options. I set ground rules before Diane arrived. No food unless I'd specifically approved it. The list of safe snacks was on the fridge. If Oliver got hungry and something wasn't on the list, she should text me immediately. I showed her where the EpiPens were kept, walked through the signs of anaphylaxis one more time, made her repeat back the emergency steps. Diane smiled through all of it with that same patient expression people use on overprotective parents. "I've raised children before," she said. "I think I can handle an afternoon." Jennifer kissed Oliver goodbye, told him to be good for Grandma, and we left for what should have been 3 hours, maximum. I called twice during the drive to Jennifer's office. Both times Diane assured me everything was fine. Oliver was watching cartoons. They were playing with his action figures. No problems. But my hands wouldn't stop gripping the steering wheel too tight, and when Jennifer asked if I was okay, I just nodded and tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. We'd been at Jennifer's office for 90 minutes when my phone rang. Diane's name on the screen. I answered expecting an update or a question about snacks, but instead, I heard chaos. Oliver screaming in the background, Diane's voice high and frantic. "Something's wrong with him. His face is swelling. I don't know what happened." My brain went into pure survival mode. I was already running for the car before she finished the sentence, Jennifer right behind me, both of us shouting questions into the phone. "Where are the EpiPens? Did you give him the EpiPens? What did he eat?" Diane kept saying she didn't know, that Oliver had just started reacting out of nowhere. I told her to call 911 immediately, to give him the EpiPen from the kitchen drawer while we drove. The 18-minute drive back to our house felt like 18 hours. Jennifer was crying, calling her mother on her own phone, trying to walk her through the emergency protocol. I drove 20 miles over the speed limit and prayed to anyone listening that we wouldn't be too late. We beat the ambulance by 30 seconds. I burst through the front door to find Oliver on the couch, his face puffed up like he'd been stung by 100 wasps, hives covering his neck and arms, wheezing with this horrible high-pitched sound that meant his throat was closing. Diane was standing over him, holding one of the EpiPens but clearly having no idea how to use it. I grabbed it from her hands, ripped off the blue safety cap, jabbed it into Oliver's outer thigh through his pants, just like we'd practiced 100 times. The click of the auto-injector, the 10 seconds of holding it in place that felt like 10 years. Oliver's breathing didn't improve immediately. I grabbed the second EpiPen from the drawer, had it ready in case the first dose wasn't enough. Then the paramedics were flooding through our door, taking over with practiced efficiency, getting Oliver onto a stretcher and an oxygen mask over his face. I rode in the ambulance while Jennifer followed in the car. And Diane came too, because she was our ride, and because Jennifer wasn't thinking clearly enough to tell her to stay behind. At the hospital, everything became a blur of forms and questions and watching doctors work on my son through a glass partition. Oliver's vitals stabilized after the second dose of epinephrine, but they kept him for observation because anaphylaxis can have a second wave hours later. Dr. Thornton arrived within 40 minutes of getting the emergency page, still in casual clothes from her weekend off. She examined Oliver thoroughly, reviewed his charts, then pulled Jennifer and me into a consultation room. "Talk me through what happened," she said, pen already moving across her notepad. Jennifer explained about the work emergency, about leaving Oliver with her mother, about getting the call. I explained finding Oliver mid-reaction, administering the EpiPens. Dr. Thornton's expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the gears turning. "What did he eat?" she asked. That's when we realized we didn't actually know. We'd been so focused on stopping the reaction that we hadn't gotten a clear answer. Dr. Thornton walked us back to Oliver's room where Diane was sitting in the corner, looking pale and shaken. The doctor introduced herself with professional courtesy, then asked directly what Oliver had consumed in the hours before the reaction. Diane's answer came too quickly, too defensive. "Nothing, just some snacks from his approved list." Dr. Thornton glanced at the chart, then back at Diane. "Children don't go into anaphylactic shock from nothing, Mrs. Brennan. Oliver was exposed to an allergen. What specifically did you feed him?" Diane's face flushed. She insisted she'd only given him crackers and apple juice from the approved list on our fridge. But something about her body language was wrong. She wouldn't make eye contact. Her hands were fidgeting with her purse strap. Jennifer noticed it too. "Mom," she said quietly, "what did you give him?" The silence that followed felt like falling. Finally, Diane admitted it. She'd given Oliver 2 almond flour cookies, homemade, from a recipe she'd found online. She'd thought they'd be healthier than store-bought snacks. She'd thought maybe if Oliver just tried them, we'd see that his allergies weren't as severe as we believed. She'd thought we were being overprotective, paranoid, making a bigger deal out of this than necessary. She'd thought wrong, obviously, but she'd meant well. "He seemed fine at first," Diane said, voice shaking now. "He ate them and nothing happened for like 20 minutes, so I thought that proved it. Then he started scratching his neck." Jennifer's face went white. I felt something cold and heavy settle in my chest. Dr. Thornton's pen had stopped moving. She looked at Diane with an expression I'd never seen on a doctor's face before. Not anger, exactly. Something colder. You deliberately fed a child with a documented life-threatening allergy to tree nuts, a food containing tree nuts? Diane tried to backtrack, to explain that she didn't think it was that serious, but Dr. Thornton cut her off. He could have died. Do you understand that? Without immediate treatment, Oliver would have died. The room went very quiet. Jennifer was staring at her mother like she was a stranger. I was trying to process the fact that someone had intentionally fed my son the one thing that could kill him because they didn't believe in his medical diagnosis. Dr. Thornton excused herself, said she needed to update Oliver's chart and notify the hospital social worker. That last part made Diane look up sharply. Social worker? Dr. Thornton's voice was even, clinical. When a child is deliberately exposed to a known allergen by a caregiver, it's hospital policy to file a report. A social worker will need to speak with everyone involved. She left the room. Diane turned to Jennifer, started trying to explain, to apologize, to make it seem less terrible than it was. But Jennifer held up a hand. Don't, she said. Just don't. Then she walked out of the room to be with Oliver. I stayed long enough to tell Diane she needed to leave. She tried to argue, said she deserved to stay and see her grandson. I told her she'd given up that right when she'd decided her opinions mattered more than medical evidence. She left, finally, and I went to find my wife and son. Oliver stayed in the hospital overnight. Dr. Thornton wanted to monitor him for a delayed secondary reaction and run some additional tests. Jennifer and I took turns sitting beside his bed while he slept, hooked up to monitors that beeped rhythmically in the darkened room. Around midnight, when Jennifer had finally dozed off in the uncomfortable chair, I walked down to the hospital cafeteria for coffee I didn't want, just needing to move, to process. That's when I saw the social worker Dr. Thornton had mentioned. Her name was Lydia Kemp, according to her badge, and she'd been reviewing Oliver's file when I approached. She introduced herself, explained that any case of potential child endangerment required investigation, asked if I had time to talk. We sat at a corner table, and I told her everything. Not just about the cookies, but about all the warning signs I'd dismissed. The almond butter, the constant boundary testing, every accident that suddenly looked less accidental in hindsight. Lydia took notes, asked clarifying questions, stayed neutral and professional. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. Has your mother-in-law had unsupervised access to Oliver before today? I thought back over 6 months of visits. The times Jennifer or I had stepped out of the room briefly. The few occasions when Diane had picked Oliver up from preschool. My mind started racing through every moment I hadn't been watching, every gap in supervision. A few times, I admitted. Short periods. Why? Lydia closed her notebook, chose her words carefully. If someone has demonstrated they don't take a child's medical needs seriously, we have to consider whether previous exposures occurred that went unnoticed. Has Oliver had any unexplained reactions or illness over the past several months? I tried to remember. There'd been one afternoon in July when Oliver had thrown up repeatedly after spending the day at Diane's condo. We'd chalked it up to a stomach bug, and another time in August when he'd developed hives that we'd attributed to a new laundry detergent. Neither incident had been severe enough to require emergency care. But now, sitting in that fluorescent-lit cafeteria, those isolated incidents started forming a pattern I'd been too close to see. Lydia saw my expression change. I'm going to recommend we interview your son when he's feeling better, she said. Sometimes children remember details adults miss. She handed me her card, told me someone from Child Protective Services would be in touch within 48 hours to follow up. The hospital was mandated to report the incident. This wasn't about punishing anyone, she assured me, but about ensuring Oliver's safety going forward. I thanked her, went back upstairs to find Jennifer awake and red-eyed from crying. I told her about the social worker conversation, about the questions Lydia had raised. Jennifer listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something that surprised me. I've been thinking about the stomach bug in July. Mom gave him cookies that day too. She said they were safe, but I didn't check the package. We looked at each other, both of us putting together the same horrifying timeline. How many times had Diane tested Oliver's allergies? How many times had we missed it? Dr. Thornton discharged Oliver the next morning with strict instructions and a prescription for 2 more EpiPens. She also gave us a referral to Dr. Michael Okonkwo, a pediatric allergist who specialized in severe cases and could provide expert documentation if needed for any legal proceedings. That phrasing stuck with me. Legal proceedings. We went home, got Oliver settled on the couch with his favorite blanket and cartoons, tried to restore some normalcy, but nothing felt normal anymore. Jennifer's phone kept buzzing with texts from her mother. Apologies, explanations, requests to talk. Jennifer ignored them all. That afternoon, while Oliver napped, we sat at the kitchen table and had the conversation we'd been avoiding. What do we do about Diane? Jennifer's voice was hollow when she finally spoke. She tried to prove us wrong and almost killed him. I don't know how to come back from that. I reached across the table, took her hand. We don't, I said. We keep him safe. That's the only priority now. The CPS investigator showed up on Monday. Her name was Angela Frost, 23 years with the department according to her introduction, and she had the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen every variety of family crisis. She interviewed Jennifer and me separately, then asked to speak with Oliver in our presence. At 4 years old, Oliver couldn't articulate everything in adult terms, but he remembered enough. Grandma had given him special cookies. They'd tasted good. His throat had started feeling funny, then scary. The look on Angela's face when Oliver demonstrated how he'd tried to breathe was the same one Dr. Thornton had worn. Professional concern, masking fury. Angela asked if Grandma had given him treats before. Oliver nodded enthusiastically. Lots of times. She said not to tell Daddy because he worries too much. Jennifer made a sound like she'd been punched. I felt my hands curl into fists under the table. Angela thanked Oliver, gave him a sticker, then asked to speak with us privately again. In the kitchen, Angela explained that based on the evidence, Diane's actions constituted reckless endangerment. The deliberate feeding of a known allergen, combined with Oliver's statement about previous unreported incidents, painted a clear picture of someone systematically undermining medical guidance. CPS would be opening a case file and strongly recommended we pursue a restraining order. She's demonstrated she can't be trusted with your child's safety, Angela said flatly. Even supervised visits would be risky at this point. She provided us with resources, including a family law attorney named Thomas Kaplan, who handled custody and protective order cases. You're going to need documentation, Angela explained. Medical records, witness statements, anything that establishes a pattern. The more evidence you have, the stronger your case. She left us with copies of her preliminary report and instructions to call if we remembered any additional incidents. After she left, Jennifer broke down completely. This was her mother. Her difficult, overbearing, but still her mother. And now we were talking about restraining orders and legal action. I called Thomas Kaplan that afternoon. His assistant got me an emergency consultation for the next day. Kaplan's office was downtown, professional and expensive looking in that way that immediately makes you worry about hourly rates. But when we met him Tuesday morning, Kaplan was straightforward and reassuring. Mid-50s, 15 years specializing in family law, he'd handled multiple cases involving grandparent access disputes. He listened to our story without interrupting, reviewed the hospital records and CPS report we'd brought, then leaned back in his chair. This is clearer than most cases I see, he said. You have documented medical evidence, witness testimony from medical professionals, and statements from your child indicating a pattern of behavior. A restraining order is absolutely justified. He outlined the process. File for an emergency protective order immediately, which could be granted within 48 hours, then a hearing within 2 weeks to make it permanent. The challenge, Kaplan warned, is that your mother-in-law may fight this. She'll claim it was a mistake, that she loves her grandson, that she deserves another chance. We filed the paperwork that day. The emergency protective order was granted Wednesday afternoon. Diane was legally required to stay at least 100 yards away from Oliver, our home, and his preschool. She wasn't allowed to contact us except through attorneys. Jennifer had to be the one to call her mother and explain. I listened from the other room as Jennifer's voice cracked, trying to explain that this wasn't vindictive, that we had to protect Oliver, that Diane had created this situation with her own choices. Diane's response, even muffled through the phone, was predictable. Shock, anger, accusations that we were overreacting and being cruel. When Jennifer finally hung up, she looked 10 years older. She said, "I'm going to regret this," Jennifer told me quietly. That she'll fight it and prove we're being unreasonable. I held her while she cried and tried not to think about how much harder this was about to get. Diane hired a lawyer, Martin Voss, according to the response filed with the court, specializing in grandparents' rights. Suddenly this became a real legal battle. Voss argued in his filings that Diane's actions were a regrettable lapse in judgment by a loving grandmother, and that a permanent restraining order was disproportionate punishment that would deny a child his constitutional right to a relationship with his grandmother. Reading those words made me want to throw something. Constitutional right? Oliver had a constitutional right not to be poisoned, but Kaplan had warned us this would happen. Grandparents' rights are tricky, he'd explained. Courts generally favor family relationships. We need to prove that maintaining contact isn't in Oliver's best interest. That meant building an ironclad case. Kaplan sent us a list of everything we needed to gather, every medical record showing Oliver's allergies and the September incident, statements from Dr. Thornton and Dr. Okonkwo, the CPS investigation report, documentation of every boundary violation we could remember. We spent days reconstructing 6 months of interactions, creating a timeline that demonstrated pattern rather than accident. Dr. Okonkwo's evaluation was particularly damning. After examining Oliver and reviewing his complete medical history, Dr. Okonkwo wrote a 4-page report detailing the severity of his allergies and the potential for fatal anaphylaxis. He noted that the September incident had been life-threatening and entirely preventable, and that anyone given care of Oliver had been provided clear, explicit instruction regarding allergen avoidance. His professional opinion, stated in clinical terms that would hold up in court, was that Diane had demonstrated willful disregard for established medical protocols that placed the child at imminent risk of death. Dr. Thornton provided a supplementary statement describing Diane's behavior at the hospital and her lack of appropriate concern. Between the two doctors, we had expert testimony that couldn't be dismissed as overprotective parents being emotional. But Kaplan wanted more than medical testimony. He recommended we document everything, create a comprehensive timeline that would withstand scrutiny. That meant going back through months of text messages, emails, calendar entries. Jennifer and I spent 3 consecutive evenings at our kitchen table, laptops open, reconstructing every interaction with Diane since she'd moved to town. What emerged was chilling in its consistency. Every 3rd or 4th visit, there'd been some food-related incident. A snack Diane tried to give Oliver that we'd intercepted. A meal she'd prepared that contained questionable ingredients. Comments about us being too strict, or making his allergies worse by avoiding everything. When laid out chronologically, it wasn't a series of innocent mistakes. It was a systematic campaign to undermine our medical authority. Jennifer cried while typing up the timeline. I defended her, she kept saying. Every time you raised concerns, I told you she was just adjusting. I didn't tell her I told you so. There was no victory in being right about this. Kaplan also suggested we interview Oliver's preschool teachers. Maybe they'd observed something during Diane's pickups. We met with his lead teacher, Amanda Torres, who'd been working in early childhood education for 14 years. Amanda remembered several incidents that hadn't seemed significant at the time, but took on new meaning now. Twice, Diane had arrived early to pick up Oliver and had been found in the snack area, just looking, according to her explanation. Once, Amanda had caught Diane trying to give Oliver a granola bar from her purse during pickup, which Amanda had politely intercepted per our standing instructions. I thought she just forgot the rules, Amanda told us. Grandparents sometimes have trouble remembering all the protocols, but now that you're telling me this other stuff... She agreed to write a statement for our attorney. Another piece of evidence. Another witness to Diane's pattern of behavior. The preschool's director, Kenneth Liu, also provided documentation. Their records showed that we'd updated Oliver's allergy action plan 3 times in 6 months, each time specifically mentioning that Diane was not authorized to make any food-related decisions for Oliver. Kenneth had even sent Diane a certified letter after the second update, reminding her of the school's strict allergy policies and her limited permissions. Diane had signed for that letter. She couldn't claim ignorance. Kenneth expressed genuine concern when we explained what had happened. If she'd managed to bring something into the classroom, he said, voice tight. If she'd given something to Oliver here where we might not have noticed immediately. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. We all understood how close this had come to being even worse. Kenneth offered to testify if needed, to provide any records that might help. The preschool had security footage, he mentioned. Nothing from September since that was at our home, but footage from previous pickups. Kaplan requested copies immediately. Reviewing that footage was surreal. Watching Diane interact with Oliver in the preschool lobby, seeing her hover near the snack table, observing her body language when Amanda redirected her. In one clip from August, you could clearly see Diane pull something from her purse and try to hand it to Oliver before Amanda intercepted. The timestamp was August 14th, 2 days before Oliver had developed those unexplained hives we'd attributed to laundry detergent. Jennifer paused the video, rewound it, watched Diane's face as she tried to sneak food to our son. She looks angry, Jennifer said quietly. When Amanda stops her, she looks angry that she got caught. We watched the clip 5 more times. Jennifer was right. That wasn't the face of a grandmother who'd innocently forgotten the rules. That was the face of someone who resented being told no. Kaplan added the footage to our evidence file. The case was becoming airtight, but every new piece of evidence felt like another small betrayal. We also had to consider Oliver's medical future. Dr. Okonkwo ran additional tests to establish baseline data and determine if the September exposure had caused any lasting damage. The final results showed no permanent damage, thankfully, but Dr. Okonkwo noted that repeated exposures could sensitize Oliver further, potentially making future reactions even more severe. If it happens again, the reaction could be faster and more intense. His immune system has been primed now. The margin for error has gotten smaller. That information went into his report too. Evidence that Diane hadn't just endangered Oliver once, but had potentially made him more vulnerable going forward. During this evidence-gathering phase, we made another disturbing discovery. Jennifer found a photo from July showing Oliver at Diane's condo with cookies containing visible chunks. The date was July 19th, the day before Oliver had gotten sick with severe vomiting. We'd chalked it up to a stomach virus. Now we realized it might have been a mild allergic reaction. The urgent care records confirmed symptoms consistent with allergen exposure. We found another incident in August. Hives after spending an afternoon at Diane's condo, which we'd attributed to detergent. 3 incidents. 3 times Diane had exposed Oliver to allergens, each one getting progressively worse as her confidence grew that nothing serious would happen. The July and August incidents had proven to Diane that Oliver's allergies weren't real, emboldening her to try the almond flour cookies in September. The preliminary hearing was set for 3 weeks out. In the meantime, we had to explain to a 4-year-old why Grandma wasn't visiting anymore. Oliver didn't understand. He liked Grandma. She gave him treats and toys. Trying to explain that Grandma had hurt him, even accidentally, without traumatizing him further, was one of the hardest conversations I'd ever had. We kept it simple. Grandma made a mistake that made him very sick, and until the grown-ups figured everything out, Grandma needed to stay away. Oliver accepted this with the easy resilience of childhood, but Jennifer and I were both quietly falling apart. She'd stopped eating regularly. I was sleeping maybe 4 hours a night, jerking awake, convinced I'd heard Oliver choking. Our marriage was strained under the weight of this crisis we hadn't asked for, created by someone who was supposed to love our child. Then Diane escalated. 2 weeks before the hearing, Jennifer's phone started blowing up with messages from relatives we barely spoke to. Diane had apparently launched a campaign to every family member within calling distance, painting us as vindictive and cruel for keeping Oliver from his loving grandmother over one little mistake. Cousins we hadn't talked to in years were suddenly texting Jennifer, asking if she was really doing this to her own mother. Jennifer's aunt called to lecture her about forgiveness and family loyalty. Even Jennifer's brother, who lived in California and had minimal involvement in our lives, called to ask if we were being too harsh. The pressure was immense. Jennifer started doubting herself, wondering if maybe we were overreacting, if maybe there was a middle ground. I had to keep reminding her what we'd almost lost. Oliver's swollen face, the sound of him struggling to breathe, the doctor's words, he could have died. That snapped her back to reality every time, but I could see it taking a toll. The family pressure campaign got worse. Diane's sister, Jennifer's Aunt Carol, showed up at our house unannounced on a Saturday morning, demanding we talk. I answered the door to find her standing on our porch with a casserole and a self-righteous expression. "This has gone far enough," Carol announced. "Diane made a mistake, but you're destroying the family over it." I tried to explain that Diane had deliberately fed Oliver something that nearly killed him, but Carol talked over me. According to her version, which she'd apparently gotten straight from Diane, the cookies had been accidentally mislabeled, and Diane had panicked during the reaction, which was why she'd seemed confused at the hospital. It was revisionist history, a complete rewriting of events to absolve Diane of responsibility. When I pointed out the Facebook posts and the pattern of behavior, Carol dismissed it as us looking for things to be upset about. Jennifer joined me at the door, heard Carol's speech, and quietly asked her to leave. Carol left the casserole on the porch with a comment about us coming to our senses eventually. We threw the casserole away without opening it. Neither of us could stomach eating anything from Diane's side of the family right now. The calls and messages continued. Jennifer's phone became a source of constant stress. Every notification could be another relative trying to guilt-trip her into dropping the restraining order. Some were subtler than others. Her cousin Emily sent a long text about the importance of forgiveness and how families work through hard things together. Her uncle Richard left a voicemail about how Diane was devastated and barely eating, and how Jennifer would regret this someday. The worst was a message from Diane's best friend, a woman named Patricia, who'd known Jennifer since childhood. Patricia sent a 3-paragraph text detailing Diane's mental state, how she was crying constantly, how she'd taken time off work because she couldn't function. "She made one mistake," Patricia wrote. "One mistake, and you're treating her like a criminal." Jennifer showed me the message with shaking hands. "Am I being cruel?" she asked. I pulled up photos from the hospital. Oliver with the oxygen mask, the hives covering his neck, the medical chart showing his vitals crashing. "This is what her one mistake looked like," I said. "We're not being cruel. We're being parents." Kaplan had warned us this would happen, but experiencing it was different from being prepared for it. He suggested Jennifer consider changing her phone number, at least temporarily, to reduce the harassment. She refused. "They're my family," she said. "I'm not going to hide." Instead, she drafted a group message to everyone who'd contacted her. I watched her type and revise it for 30 minutes, choosing each word carefully. The final version was calm, factual, and devastating. "Mom deliberately fed Oliver food she knew he was allergic to because she didn't believe his medical diagnosis. He nearly died. We are not punishing her for a mistake. We are protecting our child from someone who has proven she can't be trusted with his life. This is not up for debate. If you choose to support her version of events over the documented medical evidence, that's your choice, but don't contact us again." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. Within an hour, the messages slowed. A few relatives tried to argue back, but Jennifer blocked their numbers. Her phone finally went quiet. The silence felt like loss and relief in equal measure. Kaplan warned us this was a common tactic. "The other side will try to make this about family dynamics and hurt feelings," he said. "We need to keep it focused on child safety and medical facts. Emotions are valid, but the law cares about evidence." He'd been preparing our case methodically, organizing every document, preparing witnesses, anticipating Voss's arguments. The night before the hearing, Kaplan called with one more question. "Is there any chance Diane kept records? Photos, social media posts, anything that might show her mindset?" Jennifer thought about it, then remembered her mother's Facebook. Diane was constantly posting about Oliver, documenting their time together. We pulled up her profile and started scrolling. What we found was worse than we'd expected. Multiple posts over the past 6 months about modern parents being too worried about everything, and children being tougher than we give them credit for. One post from August, 3 weeks before the cookie incident, with a link to an article about food allergies being overdiagnosed. Another from July. "Sometimes grandmas know best, even when parents disagree." We screenshot everything, sent it to Kaplan. He called back within 10 minutes. "This is gold," he said. "She documented her entire belief system. This wasn't an accident. This was ideological." The hearing took place in family court on a cold morning in October. Jennifer and I arrived early with Kaplan, who'd coached us on courtroom protocol and what to expect. Diane was already there with Voss, sitting on the opposite side of the room. She looked smaller somehow, older. When Jennifer walked in, Diane tried to make eye contact, but Jennifer looked away. The judge was Honorable Ruth Delgado, 32 years on the bench according to Kaplan's briefing. She had a reputation for being fair but tough, particularly in cases involving child welfare. Judge Delgado reviewed the case file in silence, then asked each attorney to present their opening statements. Voss went first, painting a picture of a grandmother who'd made one mistake in an otherwise loving relationship, arguing that the restraining order was excessive and that supervised visits would be appropriate. Kaplan's response was clinical and devastating. This wasn't one mistake. This was a pattern of behavior demonstrating someone who valued her own beliefs over medical evidence, documented through social media posts, witness statements, and nearly fatal consequences. Judge Delgado called Dr. Thornton as the first witness. Under oath, Doctor. Thornton explained anaphylaxis in terms a non-medical professional could understand, walked through the September incident in detail, and stated unequivocally that Diane's actions constituted medical neglect. Voss tried to cross-examine, suggesting that maybe Diane simply didn't understand the severity. Dr. Thornton shut that down immediately. I personally explained the risks to Mrs. Brennan on 3 separate occasions, including showing her photographs of children in anaphylactic shock. She understood. She simply chose not to believe it. Next was Dr. Okonkwo, who provided additional context on Oliver's specific allergies and the likelihood of future reactions. His testimony included a statement that made Diane visibly flinch. If this exposure had occurred somewhere without access to emergency medication, the outcome would almost certainly have been fatal. Kaplan then entered into evidence the Facebook posts, projecting them on a screen for the courtroom to see. Diane's own words, preserved in digital format, demonstrating her skepticism about childhood allergies. Dr. Thornton's testimony was methodical and damning. Kaplan walked her through Oliver's complete medical history, establishing the timeline of his allergy diagnosis at 18 months old. Dr. Thornton explained the testing process, the skin prick tests that had shown massive reactions to tree nuts, the blood work confirming dangerously high IgE levels. Oliver's numbers were among the highest I've seen in pediatric patients, she testified. We're talking about a child whose immune system treats tree nut proteins like a lethal threat. His body's response isn't an overreaction, Aurora. It's proportional to what his immune system perceives as danger. She walked through the emergency protocols she'd established with us, showed the court copies of the written instructions she'd provided. Then Kaplan asked about her interactions with Diane. Doctor. Thornton's jaw tightened slightly. Mrs. Brennan attended one of Oliver's follow-up appointments at the parents' request. I spent 45 minutes explaining his condition, showing her reaction charts, explaining the mechanism of anaphylaxis. She asked questions that suggested skepticism. Things like, are you sure it's not just anxiety? And, could he grow out of it if we just expose him gradually? Voss objected, claiming this was speculation about his client's state of mind, but Judge Delgado overruled. The witness is testifying to direct statements made to her. Continue, Doctor. Dr. Thornton nodded. I explained that desensitization therapy exists, but requires years of careful medical supervision, and that Oliver's reaction severity made him a poor candidate at his age. Mrs. Brennan seemed dissatisfied with that answer. She said something like, in my day, kids ate everything and were fine. I corrected her, explained that children absolutely died from allergies before we had emergency medications and protocols. She didn't seem convinced. Kaplan introduced medical records showing Diane had been present at that appointment, signed in on the visitor log. She couldn't claim later that she hadn't been educated. The records proved she'd been given every opportunity to understand and had chosen not to. Kaplan then asked Dr. Thornton about the September incident. Walk us through what you saw when you arrived at the hospital, he said. Doctor. Thornton's testimony about the hospital encounter was visceral. Oliver was in severe respiratory distress when I arrived. His oxygen saturation was 83%, above normal is 95 or above. His face and neck were edematous, meaning swollen with fluid. He had urticaria, hives, covering most of his visible skin. He was wheezing audibly, which indicated significant airway constriction. The ER team had already administered 2 doses of epinephrine and started him on oxygen and antihistamines. When I interviewed the family, Oliver's father was coherent and could describe the timeline clearly. His mother, Jennifer, was understandably emotional, but provided details. Mrs. Brennan? Doctor. Thornton paused, choosing words carefully. Mrs. Brennan's affect was unusual. She didn't seem appropriately distressed for the situation. When I explained how close Oliver had come to respiratory arrest, she said something like, but he's fine now, right? It struck me as minimizing. When I asked what Oliver had eaten, she initially claimed she didn't know, then reluctantly admitted to the almond flour cookies only when pressed repeatedly. Kaplan introduced the hospital's incident report, which corroborated Dr. Thornton's account. The report noted, caregiver unable to provide clear timeline of exposure, and concerning lack of awareness regarding severity of patient's condition. Dr. Thornton continued. What concerned me most was Mrs. Brennan's comment as I was leaving. She said, I guess he really is allergic. not with relief or guilt, but with surprise, as though this was new information. It suggested to me that she'd conducted an unauthorized test. She'd given him tree nuts deliberately to see what would happen. Voss tried to object that this was speculation, but Kaplan countered that it was a reasonable inference from direct observation. Judge Delgado allowed the testimony to stand. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of the court reporter's fingers on the steno machine. Jennifer was crying quietly beside me, and even Diane looked shaken by the clinical recitation of her grandson's near death. Next, Kaplan called Angela Frost from CPS. Angela's testimony was equally thorough. She described her interview with Oliver, played an audio recording of his statement about Grandma giving him secret treats that Daddy wasn't supposed to know about. Hearing Oliver's small voice on the recording, so innocent and trusting, made my throat tight. Angela testified about the pattern of concealment Diane had established, teaching Oliver to hide food consumption from his parents. This is a common tactic in cases of medical neglect, Angela explained. The caregiver undermines parental authority and medical guidance while establishing themselves as the fun adult who doesn't have arbitrary rules. It's particularly dangerous when the rules being violated exist for safety reasons. She walked through her investigation findings, the timeline we'd helped construct, the preschool footage showing Diane's repeated attempts to bypass protocols. Voss tried to paint Angela as biased against grandparents, but Angela calmly cited her 23 years of experience and noted that she'd investigated plenty of cases where grandparents were protective and appropriate. This isn't about grandparent rights, Angela said firmly. This is about a child's right to be safe from someone who has demonstrated they can't provide that safety. When it was Voss's turn to present evidence, he called Diane to the stand. She was crying before she even sat down, which felt performative to me, but might have been genuine remorse. Under Voss's questioning, she explained how much she loved Oliver, how she'd only wanted to help him overcome what she thought was an exaggerated fear, how horrified she'd been when he'd reacted. I would never intentionally hurt my grandson, Diane said through tears. I made a terrible mistake, but it came from a place of love. Kaplan's cross-examination was brutal and precise. He walked Diane through every conversation where we'd explained the allergies, every warning label she'd ignored, every boundary she'd crossed. He asked about the Facebook posts. Diane tried to claim they were taken out of context, but the posts spoke for themselves. Then Kaplan asked the question that broke the case wide open. Mrs. Brennan, in your opinion, does Oliver actually have life-threatening food allergies? Diane hesitated. I believe he might be sensitive to some foods, but, Kaplan pressed. Yes or no, Mrs. Brennan? Do you believe medical professionals when they say Oliver could die from exposure to tree nuts? The silence stretched out. Finally, Diane admitted it. I think the doctors are being overly cautious. Children's immune systems are stronger than our... Kaplan cut her off. Thank you. No further questions. Judge Delgado didn't need long to deliberate. After a brief recess, she returned with her ruling. The restraining order would be made permanent. Diane was prohibited from any contact with Oliver, directly or indirectly, until Oliver turned 18, or until such time as Diane completed a court-mandated educational program about childhood allergies and provided written acknowledgement from a medical professional that she understood the severity of Oliver's condition. Additionally, Judge Delgado strongly suggested the district attorney's office review the case for potential criminal charges of child endangerment. This court finds, Judge Delgado stated, that the respondent's actions were not merely negligent, but demonstrated a reckless disregard for a child's well-being that rises to the level of abuse. The petitioners have met their burden of proof that contact with the respondent poses a clear and present danger to the minor child. Diane sobbed. Voss looked defeated. Jennifer squeezed my hand so tight I lost circulation. We'd won. Oliver was safe. Outside the courthouse, Kaplan explained that the district attorney would likely pick up the case given the judge's comments, but that criminal proceedings were separate from the family court order. He recommended we cooperate fully with any investigation, but not to expect a trial anytime soon. These cases moved slowly through the system. What mattered was the restraining order. Diane couldn't come near Oliver. If she tried, she'd face immediate arrest and contempt of court charges. We thanked Kaplan, promised to stay in touch, and drove home in stunned silence. Part of me expected to feel triumphant, vindicated. Instead, I just felt exhausted and sad. This was Jennifer's mother, a woman who'd raised her, loved her in her own dysfunctional way, and who'd now been legally barred from knowing her grandson because she couldn't accept basic medical reality. Jennifer cried the whole way home. Not for her mother's loss, she told me later, but for the grandmother Oliver would never have. For the relationship that had been destroyed by stubbornness and pride. The district attorney did eventually file charges. 3 months later, Diane was formally charged with reckless endangerment of a minor and child abuse. Voss negotiated a plea deal. 2 years probation, mandatory completion of an educational program on food allergies and child safety, community service, and an acknowledgement on record that her actions had been dangerous. No jail time, but a permanent mark on her record. The plea hearing was quick. Diane stood before a different judge, admitted to the facts as stated, and was sentenced according to the agreement. We didn't attend. Jennifer didn't want to see her mother again, and I certainly had no interest. Kaplan relayed the outcome and assured us the restraining order remained in effect independent of the criminal case. Diane's lawyer filed an appeal 6 months later, arguing the permanent restraining order was excessive now that Diane had completed the educational requirements. Judge Delgado denied the appeal. The order would stand until Oliver was 18. Diane could provide all the certificates of completion she wanted, but she'd already proven she couldn't be trusted with his life. The criminal proceedings were more involved than I'd expected. The assistant district attorney assigned to the case was Victoria Chen, who'd spent 8 years prosecuting child welfare crimes. She was direct and pragmatic about the likely outcome, a plea deal. She was right. Voss negotiated for weeks, initially proposing probation only with no admission of wrongdoing. Victoria rejected it immediately. Eventually, they reached the agreement. Guilty plea to reckless endangerment, 2 years probation, education, community service, and permanent record. Jennifer struggled with the criminal case. Part of her wanted her mother punished, but another part felt guilty. "She's 67, Jennifer said one night. "She's going to have a criminal record for the rest of her life." I reminded her that Diane had created this situation. Jennifer started seeing a therapist, Dr. Raymond Wu, who helped her process what he called ambiguous loss, grieving someone who was still alive but no longer in her life. Jennifer still had hard days when she'd see mothers and daughters together and feel the loss viscerally. 4 months after the restraining order, Jennifer ran into Diane at a grocery store. It wasn't planned, pure unfortunate coincidence. Jennifer's first instinct was to approach, to talk, to somehow bridge the gap. But then she remembered Oliver's swollen face, and the instinct died. She left the store without finishing her shopping. Diane called out her name once, but Jennifer kept walking. That incident triggered a setback in Jennifer's therapy. Dr. Wu walked her through the evidence systematically, helping her see past the emotional manipulation. He also pointed out something crucial. Diane had never actually apologized. Not really. She'd said she was sorry Oliver got hurt, sorry things escalated. But she'd never said, "I was wrong to doubt his allergies," or "I endangered him and I take full responsibility." All her apologies had been about our reactions, not her actions. If Diane couldn't admit she'd been wrong even after nearly killing Oliver, she couldn't be trusted to behave differently in the future. Meanwhile, Oliver was adapting to life without his grandmother better than either of us. Children are resilient in ways adults aren't. He asked about Grandma occasionally in the first few months, but as time passed, his questions became less frequent. By 6 months out, he barely mentioned her. We'd explained in simple terms that Grandma had given him food that made him very sick, and that until Grandma learned how to keep him safe, she needed to stay away. Oliver accepted this with the straightforward logic of childhood. Dr. Thornton referred us to a child psychologist, Dr. Nina Volkova, who assessed Oliver and concluded he was coping well. "Children this age are adaptable," she explained. "As long as his primary attachment figures remain stable, he'll adjust." Dr. Volkova also helped us prepare for when Oliver got older, providing frameworks for age-appropriate explanations. She warned us that when Oliver reached adolescence, he might become curious about his grandmother and want to reconnect. We agreed that if Oliver, as a teenager or adult, wanted contact with Diane, we wouldn't forbid it. But we'd educate him fully about what had happened and let him make an informed choice. Oliver is 6 now, 18 months after the incident that nearly killed him. He doesn't really remember his grandmother anymore, which breaks Jennifer's heart in complicated ways. We've moved on as best we can, though Jennifer still has moments where the guilt and anger and grief all hit at once. She's in therapy, working through the trauma of having to choose between her child and her mother. That it wasn't really a choice doesn't make it easier. I carry the EpiPens everywhere, still compulsively check ingredient labels, still feel my heart rate spike when Oliver tries new foods. Dr. Thornton says these behaviors are normal PTSD responses and will fade with time, but I'm not convinced. Some fears are earned. We've built a good life. Oliver started kindergarten last fall, loves soccer, has friends. His teachers know about his allergies. We have multiple emergency action plans on file. He wears a medical alert bracelet. We're careful, maybe overly so, but we're never careless again. Sometimes I wonder if Diane thinks about that afternoon, if she replays the moment she handed those cookies to a 4-year-old boy and convinced herself she was helping him. If she understands yet that her need to be right mattered more to her than his need to breathe. I'll never know, and honestly, I don't care. She made her choices. We made ours. Oliver is alive and healthy because we took his allergies seriously, because we trusted medical professionals over pride, because when it mattered most, we chose his safety over family harmony. That's the only relationship that counts. The rest is just noise. Last week, Oliver asked me why some kids can eat peanut butter and he can't. I explained about allergies in simple terms, how some bodies react differently to foods, how his body thinks tree nuts are dangerous, even though they're not for everyone else. He accepted this with the straightforward logic of childhood. "So my body is trying to protect me," he said, "even though it makes things harder." "Exactly right," I told him. Sometimes protection looks like difficulty. Sometimes safety looks like missing out. Sometimes love means making the hard call even when everyone around you says you're overreacting. Oliver nodded seriously, then asked if he could have a popsicle. Cherry, not almond. Safe. Always safe. And I handed it to him with the same careful attention I've given every food since that terrible September afternoon, because some lessons you only need to learn once. Trust your gut, believe the doctors, and never ever compromise on your child's life to make someone else comfortable with their ignorance. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.